So far, we've considered whether or not God could be the source of morality or the grounds of what makes something right. It turns out that there's reason to be skeptical of that approach. So then we looked at whether the golden rule could instead be the grounds of what makes things right or wrong. And once again, we saw that there's objections to that approach. But you might think that there's something right about the golden rule. There's something about it that intuitively we might want to accept. That's what we're going to explore now. General idea then is maybe there's something about the golden rule, something about consistency or rationality or well-being that will be the basis for why we should be motivated to do what's right and avoid doing what's wrong. So let's go with consistency first. Let's take a look at this. Even if we think, for instance, that the golden rule was problematic for different reasons, for instance, we saw that it can't apply to everyone everywhere because there are some people out there, like the masochistic person, who wants to be treated poorly. Nonetheless, it looks like there's something right about it, but we want to know what exactly is it about the golden rule that seems intuitively appealing. You might think that what seems right about it is exactly the same thing that causes problems for it, and that's consistency. So here's what I mean by this. The golden rule essentially is asking us whether the action in question could be consistently carried out by everyone in that situation. If it could, then it would be consistent. But if it could not be, well, like in the case of the masochistic person, then it would not be considered consistent. You might think there's more to consistency than just this. For instance, we might think that part of being consistent involves imagining what the world would be like if literally everyone in the world did that very thing. Would we want to live in that kind of a world? And it asks us not only to think about whatever action and how it would potentially affect us in that situation. Consistency also asks us to consider how the action would affect other people too. So you might think that that's also a part of what we need to consider when we're thinking about consistency, whether or not the action can be consistently carried out by everyone in that situation. Now, this approach that really takes seriously this notion of consistency was held by a philosopher named Immanuel Kant, who lived from 1724 to 1804. Kant was an Enlightenment thinker, also a philosopher, and he came up with what's known as the categorical imperative. This says, act only according to that maxim through which you can at the same time will that it became or becomes a universal law. Now, there's a lot of jargon here that needs to be kind of cashed out in a little more detail. For instance, what Kant here means by maxim means something like some command or some principle of action. So we should only act in certain ways. We should only do certain things insofar as those things could be become a universal law. So what do we mean by universal law here? This is tied into the notion of consistency, right? We are trying to imagine where the action is treated like a law of nature, where we can't help but do that very thing, right? It's treated universally where everyone is doing exactly that same action that we're talking about, whatever that action happens to be. So suppose that you want to know whether or not it's morally permissible to tell a lie. Let's put meat on the bones here. According to the categorical imperative, there's actually several steps that we need to take to decide whether or not telling a lie is ever morally permissible. So the first step says that we need to consider a hypothetical world where everyone is performing that action. In this case, the action is telling a lie. That's our maxim. Everybody must tell a lie as if it's a universal law that we all must do. The second step says that we need to ask ourselves whether some sort of contradiction or absurdity would arise in that world. And it looks like there would be in the case of telling a lie. Why is that? Well, just imagine what happens when every single time a person says something, it's a lie. Kant thinks that in that hypothetical world, language itself would break down. Nobody would trust anything that anybody ever says. And so the whole point of communicating would sort of become useless. If everybody was constantly lying, then it looks like nobody would trust anything that anybody says. And so whatever people say would just be meaningless or absurd. So language would become useless. It would break down. And if language breaks down, then it would become impossible to tell a lie because you would need to have language in the first place in order to be able to tell a lie. So in this world where everybody is telling a lie, it becomes impossible because language would break down, which means that we generate a kind of an absurdity or some sort of quasi contradiction. So the result here for the second step is simply that there would be some sort of an absurdity. The third step then says, if the answer is yes, you know right away that the action is not moral, right? So we can kind of stop at this point because according to Kant, since there is this absurdity that arises that's generated by trying to imagine this sort of hypothetical world, then it fails the second step. But if it turns out that the answer is no, if we are considering some sort of case where the action passes the first two steps, then we move on to the fourth step. And the fourth step says we need to ask ourselves whether you would want to live in such a world. If we would want to live in that world, then the action we're considering is morally permissible. Now, I think at this point it's worth mentioning that the categorical imperative for Kant is actually a kind of normative theory. It tells us what actions are morally permissible and which actions are not. It doesn't necessarily tell us what makes an action morally permissible, what grounds morality. And that's the main question that we're considering. Nonetheless, you still might think that consistency is really important. Kant thought that there is an important connection between morality, consistency, and rationality. So maybe these have something to do with what grounds morality. Consider, for example, mathematics and logic. A part of what it means to say that mathematics is consistent is just basically the fact that it applies to everyone, everywhere, universally, no matter who you are, right? Math is going to be the same on Earth as it is on Mars. It doesn't matter whether you're 5 years old or 50 years old, whether you're male or female, what country you live in. None of that really matters. Math doesn't respect who you are. 2 and 3 will always equal 5, even if you disagree. And this means that math is objective and universal. And the same point can be said with regard to logic, right? Logic is consistent insofar as it applies universally everywhere for everyone. It doesn't respect persons, right? Hence, logic is also objective and universal in this sense. Morality is like mathematics and logic insofar as it hinges on consistency and rationality. And if this is right, then you might think that we can appeal to the principle of consistency as what grounds morality, which would be something like the capacity to reason and think logically. Now, there's a different way to think about this that has to do more specifically with rationality. Kant actually had a second formulation of the categorical imperative, and this was known as principle of ends. Sometimes it's also called the law of humanity. And what this principle says is that our actions should be such that we treat humanity, whether we're talking about other people or ourselves, always as an ends and never as a mere means to some end. Again, we need kind of put meat on the bones and cash out what exactly this means. It tells us that we should always respect people as persons. That is, we should respect their rationality. We should respect their ability to think and reason for themselves. We should not treat people as mere tools or as a mere means to get something that we want. We should not use people. They're not objects, they're people. Let's think about an example that would help us understand what this is saying. Notice that we do treat people as tools to get things that we want. We do this all the time. For instance, right now, I'm treating you to get something I want. You, as my student, are a means to certain ends that I have, namely, the most straightforward is a paycheck, but there's other things that I'm trying to get as well, like better experience being a teacher, for instance. So in that regard, I'm using you to get something. I'm treating you as a kind of a tool. But I don't treat you as a mere tool. You're not a mere means to get something I want. I don't believe that you're an object to be used. I believe that you're a person. You have personhood. You have rationality, and I am respecting that. Likewise, you are treating me as a means to get something you want. I am a tool for you. That's because you probably want to get a good grade, get a degree, and then one day get a good job. And I'm a kind of a means for you to achieve that particular goal, that end. But hopefully, you are not treating me as a mere object or a tool to get what you want. You're not treating me only as a means. Rather, you are treating me as a person with rationality. You're respecting my personhood, even though you are using me in some regard. So, what Kant really means here with regard to the principle of ends or the law of humanity is simply that what grounds morality is essentially tied to having some form of rationality, some capacity to think and reason for ourselves. So, then it's clear, for Kant at least, that morality is closely tied to consistency and logic and rationality. Nonetheless, even if you think there's something right about this kind of approach, you still might be skeptical. You might think that there's problems with this approach as well. For instance, you might think that appealing to rationality is just too sophisticated or over intellectualized. Or you might think there's borderline cases. A borderline cases where we take somebody who we typically think belongs in the moral community, someone who morality applies to, but they happen to lack rationality. What should we say about these sort of people? For instance, if we consider someone like an infant or a young child, these sort of individuals are not yet rational, but we probably think that morality still applies to them. We generally think that things like infanticide is morally wrong. We think that it's morally wrong to neglect one's child. Likewise, there may be an adult who's experiencing some kind of a brain injury or something like dementia or Alzheimer's. These sort of individuals once had rationality, but they no longer are considered to be fully rational. Would it be wrong to harm them? Most people would say yes. Of course, it's wrong to harm someone who has Alzheimer's simply because they're no longer rational. But this generates a very important question. Should we say that morality does not apply to these individuals because they're not rational? Intuitively, we want to say yes, it would be wrong to harm these individuals. But if you take Kant's approach, one that says that morality is grounded in rationality, then it's not clear what we should say about these borderline cases. Likewise, many people think that various non human animals can also be harmed. But if a non human animal, like a cow or a dog or a cat, if these non human animals can be harmed too, then it looks like morality applies to them. But if we think that morality is grounded in rationality, then why would it be morally wrong to, for instance, kick a dog? Instead, maybe what we should say is that morality is really grounded in something like well being and not merely rationality. And this introduces a different way of approaching the issue, one that sees morality as being grounded in something like happiness or well being. This is a view that's sometimes associated with normative theories known as consequentialism or utilitarianism. These are views that date all the way back to the Greek philosopher Epicurus, but also was made more famous by Jeremy Bentham and John Stuart Mill, who were both proponents of the utilitarian approach. Now, this kind of view, again, it's a normative theory, so it tells us which actions are morally right and wrong. But this view says that an action is right insofar as it maximizes the best consequences. And the best consequences here are understood to be some sort of happiness, the overall happiness or the overall general well being of everyone who is involved. To get a better grip on this point, we have what's known as the principle of utility. In utilitarianism, this principle says actions are right in proportion as they tend to promote happiness, wrong as they tend to produce the reverse of happiness. And by happiness is intended pleasure and the absence of pain. By unhappiness, we mean pain and the privation of pleasure. This principle of utility, for utilitarianism, tells us which actions are right and which actions are wrong. Again, this does not tell us what grounds morality. And since that's really the question we're after, we'll need to think about that in more detail. Still, we also need to consider some worries that might be associated with this kind of approach, some things that to keep in mind here. So for example, this approach to ethics should be consistent with reason and rationality. The fact that we've moved on to talking about well-being as a kind of a source or what makes something morally right and morally wrong does not in and of itself mean that we should reject rationality. If some view is not consistent, or if it violates some principles of rationality, then that would be an independent reason to reject the view. So that's something that we should keep in mind. But for our purposes now, when we're thinking about well-being and happiness, I think it's fair to say that this kind of approach is not limited to reason and rationality alone. The second thing I want you to think about is the fact that this approach grounds morality in the general overall happiness or well-being of everyone. It's not merely your own well-being. It's not merely the well-being of your close friends or family that matters. This sort of view that identifies well-being with your personal happiness is called psychological egoism. And that's not the view that we're considering now. What we are considering is overall happiness, the well-being of everyone, irrespective of who you are. It doesn't matter what your race is, your gender, your nationality, your socioeconomic status, your sexual orientation, or even what species you are. Indeed, many people would find this to be a major advantage of this kind of approach because it seems to endorse a kind of equality. And this is because what matters from a moral perspective is whether you have the ability to experience suffering or pain, whether you can experience better or worse forms of well-being. That's the primary thing that matters. And this view is what's known as an impartial view of the good, an impartial view of what makes something morally right or morally wrong. What's morally right and what's morally wrong does not depend on you or what your preferences are. It's not partial in that regard. Rather, it's impartial. And again, many people find this sort of approach very appealing. It's because it endorses this kind of egalitarianism. Oftentimes people think that that's exactly what we need for morality, is a kind of egalitarianism, some view that's impartial in this sense. And if this is right, then I do think that we'll be in a better position to say that morality is objective, it's universal, insofar as it applies to everyone, everywhere, no matter who you happen to be.